Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cold War Spaces. I'm Anna Rose, the Wende's Exhibition and Programming Associate. And today we'll be talking about a very special topic within Cold War Spaces, and that's multicolored space toward a layered history of the Cold War with our very own Justin Jampol, the Wende Museum's founder and executive director. He's a Los Angeles native, studied at UCLA and Oxford University, where he received a PhD in modern history. He began collecting Cold War artifacts in the mid-1990s and founded the museum in 2002. I'll keep this short because you'll learn all about that in the talk. And this program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Justin and Segal, the Wende's chief curator and director of programming. And we'll leave 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. Get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. Please keep them short and concise so that we can get to everyone's, or try to get to everyone's. And as we're getting started, you can say hi in the chat so that everyone can see your message and where you're tuning in from. And please remember to make sure that the chat box is addressed to everyone, not just hosts and panelists, so the messages don't just go to me. And with that, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now Yus will get us started with the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose and Justin. Welcome to Cold War Spaces. This somehow feels very close to home.
It's literally close. Are you in the next room? I don't even know if you're in the.
I am at my home now.
Oh, okay. Well, then that would be good. I was going to say, I'd just come over to your office and we could do this together. But it's great.
Okay, that's an idea for next time.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, so Justin, I want to start with the beginning of the museum. You were in your early 20s when you founded the Wende Museum. So can you tell us what motivated or inspired you to start your own museum? And also, since the museum is now almost 20 years old, what were the main steps along the road? What were the conceptions you had to adjust or the missions you had to change during this period you have been steering the museum?
Well, first of all, I want to say how thrilled I am to be here. I'm usually in the audience on this, watching Yus work his magic. So I'm thrilled to be a part of it. At the same time, the program has been so successful. It's one of my favorite things that we do here that I hope I didn't destroy your mojo here, having gone out. This is the way that we're going to end for the year. So
go for it.
I gotta go big. Well, so I 5 minutes away from here, I went to Hammy High, and I had a fantastic history teacher, Sandy Mermelstein, who was a early inspiration to me, and I had went on a transformative trip to Israel. I wanted to be an archaeologist. So I have always been, oh, look, she's even there. I just saw her with her chat. I'm so happy she could join us. That's amazing. So this is like memory lane for me. And so the idea that things are sources of information was an early part of my interest. And I think in some ways, in hindsight, I realize now we're all kind of curators of our own lives, and we have things around us, product placement, but things around us that we use and we love, and we that sort of are portals to which we can understand human behavior. So flash forward, I was in Berlin as a PhD student at Oxford, and then seeing that actually a lot of the great materials were not in some archive somewhere. They were in people's houses and attics and basements, and it was the human component, right? It wasn't that things themselves say anything. It's that it was a catalyst for people to then, because if you ask people, they'll tell me about your lives. Sometimes it can be so abstract, right? It's hard for them to think, oh, I'm going to tell you. And if they do, it's usually a narrative that's been rehearsed many times, versus if you show somebody something that had significance to them, you never know where it's going to lead. So I always find that really fascinating. And this was a history that was quickly being lost. And I just felt like this was an opportunity to not only reflect on the past, but be a part of shaping it and how we perceive history.
Yeah, so many historians actually focus on archives and study of literature, but this is a quite different type of history. How do you think does material culture enlarge or enrich the scope of historians as compared to an exclusive focus on archives?
Well, it's something I never understood, which was, why do organizations not reflect how we behave as human beings? Like, you know, there's an archive that does papers, there's a museum that does things, there's cultural institutions that do programming. There are, you know, and so these are all very sort of proprietary, isolated things. And I just don't think that we can fully understand, you know, moments in time and just things that are as complicated, as complex as decision-making processes and things like that, unless we have access to a broad range of sources. So we're not saying don't do archives. It's a very important part of what we do. It's just that we're not limited to it. And the crazy thing is, nothing to do with Cold War, but just on the very broad, visceral perspective that if we expand the boundaries of what we consider a source, we start identifying all these fantastic things that would otherwise fall through the cracks. We have a great collection of menus. Where do menus fall in, right? Like, they're sources of information. There's prices, there's ingredients, all kinds of things. So those are the kinds of things that I love that would otherwise have like not been included in one of those more established archival organizations.
Right. So the Wende Museum has quite a number of very special collections and quite unique materials. And in part, I think that's the result of your very unconventional collecting strategies, especially maybe in the first years of the museum. Can you give us an example or two how you actually acquired materials and where they came from?
Well, so, you know, full disclosure here, probably not going to surprise any of you that have been to the museum. We're not buying things at Christie's and Sotheby's, right? Like, and especially 20 years ago, this was just about a dozen years after the fall of the wall, right? So there was no understanding or appreciation yet that, like, oh, these were things were just old. They weren't historical yet in this sort of perception. And people like just assumed that these things were, you know, flea markets, and that's where they would often see things like that. But what it meant is, this is an unconventional collection. You met unconventional people that were doing these things. I remember, like, early in the days, there were these guys, right? They were called the Four Andres. 4 guys, all named Andre. Don't know if it's true still to this day. They were all bald. They dressed exactly the same. They used to show up in front of my apartment in Berlin and kind of just pop the trunk. And it was just whatever stuff they had like found. And it was like, it could have been in a dumpster. It could have been a friend's house. I mean, I don't know, right? And this was a time when people were just throwing this stuff away, and they were like, okay. Anyway, I never found out who their real names were, but for like 3 or 4 years, we would have this system where they'd come back and show me what they had, and then they would be gone. And by the way, they disappeared. This is now like 16 years ago. Never heard of Pete, but I just like...
Sounds sketchy in an adventurous way.
I don't even know what it was. Only now I look back, I'm like, oh, that was kind of strange. At the time, I was so used to it. I mean, I thought, like, such a weird job. Like, it was so much of it was relationship building. And so, you know, you'd sometimes go to these guys who were, you know, they were almost like scrap collectors, because they knew where all the stuff was. And you'd go there with a 6-pack of beer and sit down with them. You never talk about it the first time, but I'd go back and back again. They'd be like, yeah, you know, we're melting down this sculpture tomorrow. You want that? I'll sell it to you for the price of the scrap or whatever it is. So those days long gone now, but those were like the heady, early, crazy, wild days of the museum.
Right, where you acquired some street wisdom in a certain sense. I assume.
I don't know, another plug for public schools, you have the opportunity to see the way the world really works. And that's the thing is like, right, is that there were academics out there trying to find sources, but the problem was there was a big gap between the academics like me and where the sources were. So I just was like, okay, I'm not going to find them in some library. So in a way, I had the motivation. I mean, I had the reason to go out and do it. And I'm from Los Angeles. I'm comfortable with people from all walks of life. So it felt very easy to me, and I love meeting eccentric people. And many of them were very eccentric.
Right.
Including me, by the way.
So Justin, traditionally, the Cold War has been seen not only by historians, by the way, in binary terms: capitalism versus communism, democracy versus state control, freedom versus totalitarianism, etc., etc. How would you say that the Wende Museum's collection, and maybe also the mission of the museum, deals with this binary model of the Cold War?
Well, I think if we know one thing is that people are not binary. Like, I mean, I think these are very oversimplistic ways that we try to put the past in a box, and we try to fit them into neat places in our minds. But the reality is history is complicated because people are complicated. And I think that oftentimes our instincts, very human instinct towards lumping things and historical events into this binary are not really useful. And in fact, one of the things I've always been fascinated by, and the exhibitions that, also full disclosure, I have nothing to do with, that's Yus, and he does an amazing job. And one of the things I love about what Yus and the team does is that it's layers of history. Like, you can appreciate it on a visceral level. You'll get contextual information, you'll get names, dates, and places and all that. But you really start to get rewarded when you spend a little bit more time and peel back the layers. And then sometimes these things are complicated, they're problematic. And that's where the interest comes in. And I think that's what the Cold War is to me. It's complicated. And because it's complicated, there's opportunities to actually learn. Because if it all fit neatly into these boxes, you've already got it figured out. What's the point? And the reality is, when you start to dive in and the sources of information, these things, the artwork, they're catalysts. Like, they peel back the layers so that you can get a sense that there's a lot more to the story. So I mean, it's one of my favorite things about the museum. And I think it's what keeps it really fresh and interesting.
Yeah, and broadens the perspective. And yeah. So Justin, the Wende Museum is named after the German word Wende, which means change or transition or transformation. It's described for the period leading up to and including the fall of the Berlin Wall. But I think it also speaks to a certain spirit of the museum, the focus on change. And I wonder if you can say something about how the museum deals with the events leading up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and also the history after the fall of the Berlin Wall. What is the connection there?
Well, I think, it's the way in which history is often told in these bookmarks. There's World War II and it ends in 1945, and then it's like closed, and then there's a different book about the other stuff. And what I've always found periods of transition to be enormously illuminating, because you realize that that history doesn't work that way. We get scrapbooks, and it's sort of like there's young East German workers, but then you start going further back and like, oh, there's dad in the Nazi uniform. Like, these things don't just go away. Like, there are lingering threads. So the Wende is really about this moment in time, but it's really about the way that time always is moving and changing. So this is what is, referred to. The Wende is is that time of change and transformation around the time of the fall of the wall. and afterwards, but to me, it's just the starting place. Like, first of all, the museum obviously wouldn't have existed without that moment, because this is a museum that looks at that past. So it had to have happened in order for us to exist. But it was also the starting place of this process of past becoming history. And I was interested just as much in the history of what happened during the Cold War. The Wende is an organization that's just as interested in how history is shaped. It's just as much about a museum of what happened after the fall of the wall than what happened beforehand. And so this was the starting place of the museum. And it is the way that I think you and the team look at the sort of constantly shifting sands. I mean, even over the 20 years of the museum, the conversations we have with visitors, for example, totally different now than 20 years ago. And a lot of that is time and the world that we live in, and the shifts of culture and the world that we live in.
Yeah, so we explore change from a historical perspective. Would you say that we are also exploring change in a proactive way or in a present focused way?
Well, I think it was what makes this little place so interesting is that because this is a history, I mean, if we were doing, I don't know, 19th century French furniture or something like that, I mean, it'd be like, okay, it's settled, it's great. No offense to those who studied 19th century French furniture. But the Cold War is still very much in flux in terms of how we understand it. And I think we really have an opportunity here as one of the few places and organizations that deals with this kind of thing to open it up and to be not only be a kind of recorder of the process of becoming history, but we can also be an active shaper of it through these interpretations, whether it's an exhibition or program or project. And we have many, many ways, as you know, to engage around the collection.
Right. I think among our viewers is a specialist in 18th century French furniture. So you're safe for 19th century. That's always good to know. One of the, I think, very special features of the Wende Museum, already from a quite early date, is how it works together with scholars. So there's this tradition where the museum collaborates with scholars with a cutting edge or original concept, and the museum actually helps them collect materials and study them. Can you give one or two examples of such projects where the museum has engaged in very direct collaboration with original research?
Well, so, and it's actually kind of one of the magical strategies of the museum that happen, or, you know, not by design, but kind of organically, which is that because we are started out as a scholarly organization with roots in academia, and it was all about trying to sort of bridge those sources with those who need them, it often happens that the person who needs them would then come to us and say, hey, can you find, you either have these sources of information or can you help find us? So we worked with people like Juliana First, who's a specialist in Soviet hippies. She came to us and said, look, you know, I'm worried about the materials that I use, the sources of information being lost. I've written a book on this. I've spent 10 years of my life working on this. Once the archives, once the materials are, they disappear, they're gone forever. And it becomes a existential threat to that particular field or line of inquiry. So then there's a kind of a motivation and urgency to have those materials go into a publicly accessible institution. And so she, the scholar, knows where all these sources are, right? So instead of, again, of us having to initiate like, okay, what are we going to now acquire for the collection? It's an inverse model. They come to us and say, look, we want to preserve these things. We want to make sure they're safe, or whatever they are. We need to digitize them. I mean, because that's a lot of what we do. We digitize them. They keep all the stuff, but we can digitize it. Now it's preserved for everyone. And there's not this fear that it's going to go away. So oftentimes it's driven by the specialist. Leo Schmieding was another one. He was doing hip hop in the East Bloc, especially in the GDR. And he'll help find materials for us, or we'll find things to help him, or menus, as I mentioned at the top of the discussion. There, Paul Friedman at Yale did a whole book on menus, and we're like, okay, we're going to find you menus. We found menus from state dinners in Berlin of Fidel Castro, Saddam Hussein, and with the menus of what they ate, how they were served, and like the politics of food. Fascinating. We would have never have known, but by having a good, strong relationship with specialists, scholars, it's really helped us to expand the collection in a really interesting way.
Yeah, I think it's a way to actually build a very unique collection. Speaking about that, relatively recently, the museum decided to expand its geographical scope. It was originally focused on the Soviet bloc countries. Can you tell us a little bit about how it expanded and why it has expanded?
Well, I think, first of all, you can't try to do everything at once. And the Wende has always been about doing what it does very, very well, right? Because we're very specific in the sorts of things that we do. And we have a very Wende-like way to interpret these. We use a very cultural lens to assess historical events, sources of information. But in conversations with our audiences, our fantastic collections committee on the board, I think Jane Friedman might even be here with us, who's the chair of the collections committee. We just thought, and we understood the need to be a little bit more expansive in terms of geography. So we're going to be doing a show on the Cultural Revolution in China. We're going to be doing a show on Vietnam after the American intervention, so 75 and beyond. And part of what I think we do that's unique is try to provide agency. So instead of looking at the American experience, the museum is really about trying to walk in other people's shoes, to tell another side of the story. So working with curators from Vietnam, from China, to have them present their own idea or their own approach to the materials, to give it that interpretive lens. And I think, that's what makes it interesting, is that, like, especially, I do feel like Los Angeles is probably the only place where this would really work, because we're used to people from all different walks of life, and there's a sort of a diversity of experiences here that I don't know if you get in other places. It's one of the things I love about being here. And our visitors, our audiences have an understanding of like the universality of the human experience. So when we think about walls, I don't think we only think of the Berlin Wall. There are plenty of other walls in the world to think about. Issues of surveillance, of oppression, of protests, of dissidents. I mean, this is not just a Cold War thing. This is a human thing. So we're really interested in giving case studies, and the next shows that are going to come up are going to help us to tell more stories by going into other geographies.
Right. So as I mentioned, the Wende Museum has a lot of quite special and unique collections. I know that Jerry Ferris is with us today. Just to give one example, can you say something about the Ferris collection as part of our museum holdings, and how it came about?
Oh man, so that was years ago, and Jerry reached out to us, and it's again one of the joys about being in Southern California. You never know, who you're going to meet and what collections are here. And actually, one of the surprising things is so many of our fantastic collections have come from people we know. And Jerry's late husband Tom was a great collector of these dissident perestroika era materials. They're the posters that were the artist proofs in a way. They were the creation that then became the posters that they were approved, but very heady, very edgy. We've done several shows on them. And actually, if you come to our show right now, there are many works from the Ferris collection that are on view. So come and check it out.
Right. So it's almost time to go to the Q&A, and if you have questions, please put them under the Q&A box, where I will be looking for them. But before we go there, Justin, I want to ask you what you think about speaking about change, the changing role of a museum in the current moment in history, and especially also considering the political and existential crisis we are confronted with, say, climate crisis, but also the assault on democracy, the whole discussion about fake news, alternative facts. What do you think is the task of a present day museum, and what should people take away from it?
Well, it is one of the assets or benefits that a small museum has that a big one doesn't, which is that there is an opportunity here to be experimental, which I know is a word that we use a lot here, in trying to become not only a scholarly resource or fantastic or interesting and illuminating, inspiring art exhibit or art museum, but we really have an opportunity to play a very important, significant role within the community and regionally in terms of addressing some of those issues that all of us face, and doing it in a way that I think is effective. I mean, we do free yoga. We've done wellness and mindfulness classes, with the addition of the new community center next door, which is going to break ground in the next 6 to 8 weeks or so. We're going to have an opportunity there to scale up and have even more community events. But like, I think with COVID, with what we've all been through over the last year and a half, 2 years, even more importantly than I think I've understood in a way I didn't before, how important it is to have opportunities for face-to-face engagement and to have a place where people can come together in a safe way. We're very fortunate in having a garden space here, and to have a place where people are not just sniping at each other online, but having a substantive conversation. I'm amazed by the things and the conversations that we've had here about so many poignant and hot button issues. But I think you once again do a fantastic job at framing these things, and in a way that feels like it's done in an intellectual way rather than just a reactionary, responsive way. And because we're in a history museum, it's rooted in history. So I don't think it's not as some like abstract thing. That's one of the joys about being surrounded by objects that, with the right sort of interpretations, have stories to tell, because they help root us and they help sort of illuminate some of those more complex, complicated discussions that we have. And by the way, like, it is the job of a museum to be, the root of the word muse, to inspire. And one of the great projects we have, I mean, another full disclosure, almost all my favorite parts of the museum have nothing to do with why I started the museum. It's other people that have come in and infused it with something new and interesting. I think that Abby Scher might be with us, who was the visionary behind Music at the Wende. Music at the Wende is awesome. It's all this new music that we're having in performance here on Friday night. It fills the halls and the space with experimental new music, in a way that sort of gives new resonance to both the collection and the space. And to use this question, underscores like, what is a museum? And if we take that root of the word muse to inspire, to be very expansive in how we touch people and touch their lives. So I think that that's what the Wende is. That's what it can be about. And that change, by the way, it's not only historical change, it's institutional change. We've changed. And I think that's a strength. I don't think that's a weakness. I think that's a strength, to be flexible, to be nimble, to look ahead. And I think that's what I'm excited about. And as we go into our 20th year, crazy, we're totally different than we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It's a different place. And as well it should be.
Perfect. Change all over. We are going to change to the question to the Q&A box. First question is by my dear Dutch friend Jampol. What is, in your opinion, the biggest challenge for the museum at this moment?
You know what it is? It's a really great question. The problem is, and it's a double-edged sword, it's great to be the unconventional organization without the blueprint that we have. I think for those who know us, it's what gets them excited, what drives them. But there's a real challenge to it, which is that the usual suspects of funding and foundation support just don't understand it. And I mean, you're talking, especially on the state and federal level, where there's not somebody that can come in here and get to know us. If it's like a review committee of people that have never been here, we've gotten calls from the NEA or NEH. They're like, so is it cultural institution, historical collection, art gallery, music? And they're like, which box is this? And I'm like, well, it's all of them. Like, no, you can only choose one. I'm like, that defeats the purpose of this place. And it's really difficult. Like, thank goodness for those, many of you on this call, people that get it. And people that get it. And, you know, there's a wonderful part of being the first person or the first one to try new things out, but there's also, it's the challenge of it too. And sometimes I'm like, what are we doing here? And, you know, I mean, I talk to yous all the time about, you know, there's nothing that we take for granted here. Nothing is for sure in this world, in this life. And this place, very unlikely, the Wende Museum is an unlikely thing. And I think there's a certain freedom and liberation in that we can, like, but for a handful of people, we wouldn't be here. It's also galvanizing. So just as much as I think sometimes these things are difficult, it's the same thing that makes it hard also makes it so rewarding and satisfying.
Yeah, there's a question from Michelle Willens that somehow I think connects to this point. She asks, has the Los Angeles Museum cultural community welcomed you? And are there still too many locals who don't know about you?
The LA community is really great. And we have a wonderful partnerships here. And again, I think the Wende kind of thrives in a place like Los Angeles that would otherwise be a lot more difficult. Our colleagues are fantastic. I'm going to have lunch on Friday with the head of the Getty Trust, the Getty Foundation, and who are supporting one of our shows. And we have partnerships with the Holocaust Museum and Shoah Foundation. And, you know, we have wonderful partnerships and collaborations. That part has been really great. And, you know, we don't have an advertising budget, so it's word of mouth. And it's been amazing. I mean, we had this like business plan done when we first moved in, and they're like, oh, you'll get lucky if you get 1,000 people. And I think our first year we got 15,000, you know, so we get like 15-fold. It's been amazing. And the irony here is, because we don't charge for anything, that, you know, the more people come here, the more we need to fundraise to subsidize them being here. And we're actually doing great. Our last weekend was the most well-attended weekend we've ever had. Imagine that. But it also means, because the attendance is going up, up, and up, there is the cost side of it. So that's my job. My wife calls me a professional luncher, as some of those of you have heard me here say. And that's my job. And I'm an enabler now, so I can get to see Yus and his team have all the fun and do all the great work that they do. And I enjoy it. And that is an interesting, it's like, people don't talk a lot about that, but that is the relationship between attendance and cost. So that's why I'm here.
Right. So I imagine having lunch can also be a fun activity.
I love it.
But our next question is from someone you know very well, Sandy Mermelstein. And she writes, interesting to hear your views of the role of museums and the fact that you did not get your collection from auction houses, which I certainly can attest to. There has been a strong movement recently for museums to have to repatriate artifacts that were less than ethically acquired. Do you find that there have been any challenges to your collection, or is it still the case as it was early on that the respective governments are uninterested in reclaiming parts of your collection?
Well, of course, that's going to be a very interesting and important question from an archaeologist, as well as my former history teacher. I think once again, we are different in that we're more interested in the sources of information than the thing itself. And so, for example, we're just going to be embarking on a multi-year project to digitize Soviet Jewry collections and archives. We're not taking possession of it. Whenever we acquire anything, it's last resort because nobody else will. So the way that we work is we focus on endangered archives and materials. We have plenty of things. We don't want more unless, again, it's like, you need to take this or else nobody will, and it's going to be lost forever. That's our mandate. But it still happens a lot. I mean, for example, we're in the midst of this Russian archive. So you might have seen the news, or some of you might have seen the news in the last week or two. The Putin government has shut it down. One of the most important dissident archives that there is. So unfortunately, we're not in a place where people are like, oh, we should preserve these things, which would be great. In fact, we're still in the midst of the opposite. And in a situation like that as well, we'll send somebody out there to digitize it, leave the materials there. But we're just interested in the sources of information and making them available to everyone so they're not lost along the way. So that's our strategy.
Justin, we have a lot of questions still and not much time anymore. So I'm going to ask you to keep your answers.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Next one is by Marty Zisner, and he writes, the local Stasi wants to know how the Wende acquired Erich Honakers collection as opposed to ending up in other Cold War museums in the country.
Hey, Marty. So a lot of our collections have come to us because there is the person who owns the collection is trying to find a home for it. This one was the Honaker family who were placing things in other collections. And early on, one of the motivators for people to send stuff here is Los Angeles might as well be on the moon, I think, for a lot of people who are not from this particular part of the world. And, you know, these things are very fraught. They're very political. And there was a real anxiety 20 years ago or so by people who were government functionaries or certainly working for the Stasi or heads of state and worried about these things being kind of put on display as trophies. So we want to, so many times things came to us, sometimes anonymously, you know, kind of, I kept this in my closet for 20 years, didn't want to look at it again, but here you go. So the Honaker collection was one of those that we were contacted by, and they just wanted a place for it that functioned more as a scholarly archive that anybody can use for any way they want, rather than making it a kind of a Cold War victory monument. So that's the story.
Thank you. Next question is from Courtney Lamb, and she asks, I have struggled to explain the Cold War to my 10-year-old. How do you think the museum can help make this era relevant to kids? And do you even think it is something younger kids can or should engage in?
Well, so I think, so this begs a really important question, which is sort of like, well, what is it, you know, what is the role of the museum, and what is our approach to trying to engage people of different ages? obviously is very age appropriate. We're not going to like delve into the gulag system with a 7-year-old. And at the same time, it's like the way that I think of it is we come with like an empty vessel, and the museum can fill it up only to a certain extent, and the rest of that vessel is filled with your own personal experiences. So what I think we always try to do is find the connective tissue for people's own personal experiences and the history. So for young people, for example, here, we're doing a program right now on the refuseniks and Soviet Jewry, and part of what we're trying to teach them to do is like, what does it mean for people to express themselves in a way that they have the independence and freedom to be able to, to do what they want. And so there are workshops where people make their own posters. There are family days where you don't need to go into the full spectrum of the past. We can wait for that, but there's always ways to sort of introduce them to the history in a way that I think is both illuminating and may touch them and fill up their vessel in ways that mean something to them personally.
Right. Next question is from Karen Fichelis. I hope I pronounced it correctly. And she asked, will there be art or cultural presentations from local celebrity artists like Val Kilmer or Umar Rashid or unknown emerging artists? So maybe you can say something about how we collaborate with contemporary artists in general.
Well, it is one of the things that I think makes the Wende stick out and is really unique, is that we understand that things need interpretation. There are different lenses according to different perspectives that are used. And therefore, we work with a lot of contemporary artists who help for us to understand the collections through different lenses. And Yuz always does a fantastic job at identifying those contemporary artists who I think will bring a lot to the collection. So there's always opportunities from filmmakers, poets, fine artists, and we've worked with everyone from Shepard Fairey to Sing Chong Zi, who is our current artist in residence here at the Wende.
I want to conclude with a question.
Wait, we lost you, Yuz. We lost you for a sec. Oh, we don't hear you.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. The final question is from Disa Lindgren. She asked, this is so interesting. Thank you for talking with us about the Wende Museum. I'm wondering why you chose the name MultiColored Space for the title of this discussion. It's clear that history is layered, but I'm intrigued by the reference to multicolored. Does it have a special meaning?
Yuz, you're probably the one, since you chose that name. I think you're probably the right one to answer it. I have thoughts, but I'll let you answer it.
Okay, my answer would be that traditionally Cold War history has been told a lot in terms of black and white, these binary oppositions we discussed. And I think the Wende Museum and the collection does an amazing job in adding these multi-perspectival layers, and you can call it the multicolored layers because they come from so many different directions that enrich our perspective of the past. But for me, another direct reference was what can be seen as the mascot of the Wende Museum, our pink Lenin sculpture that was spray painted during the Monday demonstrations in Leipzig just weeks before the fall of the Berlin Wall, in an attempt to make to give Lenin a kind of pop look and make him more colorful. And I thought of all the implications, cultural implications such an act might have. But Justin, please give your perspective as well.
No, I think you said it very well. And I love that you mentioned the mascot. The pink Lenin is one that would immediately come to mind as well. And I think it's also that, I think when you say history, people have this idea of black and white archival imagery, film. The thing about this time period is that it's in color, like not only technically, because now we have the capacity to be able by the 70s and 80s that it's oftentimes in color, But the way that we see the past, it's not a far away past, it's a recent past. It's recent. In the grand scheme of things, this was yesterday, and some would argue it's still going on, that the Cold War continues. And I think just that process of the question mark, there's an implicit question mark, I think, that is associated with everything that we do. And I think even the name sometimes, Wende, is a question, because it's constantly transformational. And it was a time in history when the Berlin Wall fell that there was an implicit question mark of what comes next. And I still don't think we have an answer.
Right. Justin, I want to thank you very much for this intriguing interview. It was a special fun experience for me to speak with you in this series. It was completely different from all the other interviews. And I appreciate having you.
That's both ways.
Great.
Sounds good. All right, thank you, everyone.
One more interview to go, and I have to apologize for the questions we weren't able to answer today because of the time. In 2 weeks, December 15th, my guest is Maya Balakirski-Katz, who is a professor of Jewish art at the Bar Ilan University in Ramat Gan near Tel Aviv. And with her, I will be speaking about the Jewish artists who were engaged in the Soviet animation industry. And that will conclude this series. In January, we are starting a new series called In Search of Truth, in conjunction with our current exhibition, Questionable History, where we are going to investigate, research the concept of truth from many different perspectives, from evolution and history to art, philosophy, journalism, science, social media, etc. And I'm mentioning that because today is the deadline for a call for applications. We are looking for a student council age 16 to 26 to co-organize and co-present this series. So if you're interested, please send me an email today. And with that, thank you all for watching and hope to see you in 2 weeks.
Bye, everyone.